2. So I'm going to cycle through this a little bit quicker. I think mental well-being, the stuff is probably a little bit easier to grasp, but yeah, just due to time, we'll kind of move through it so we get to research methods as well. Again, any questions that you have on that, feel free to pop it through in the live chat. And then again, you will get a copy of these slides as well. Okay, so obviously we are going to be talking about mental well-being. We're going to be talking about mental health, that sort of thing. If there's anything here that, you think isn't the best thing to listen about, of course, that's completely fine. And also feel free to use any of these resources. It's really important to be looking after yourself. I know this, might sound a little bit cliche, but year 12 is obviously, assuming most of you are in year 12, you may be in year 11 as well. But it can be really quite stressful. Again, we're getting to the middle of the year. Next semester, term 3 for me was the hardest term. I found it to be, because obviously it's before exam time, you've got all your sacs going on, and you might be cramming a little bit. It can get really stressful. And also something for me that I found to be a cause of stress was that I felt really sort of demotivated. I didn't have like the energy I had in Sem 1. And that can kind of put you into a little bit of an academic slump almost. So just be mindful of that, and also make sure you are not overworking yourself. You don't want to burn out, all of those sorts of things. So yeah, just be really aware and kind of check in with yourself, especially when you learn about this sort of thing as well. It's really, really important to make sure that you are asking for help if you need it, basically. Okay, so with our mental well-being or mental health, we look at it on a continuum. So kind of like what I was talking about before with consciousness. It's not a, mentally healthy and then you step down and then mental health problem and then step down and then mental health disorder. It's this idea that you can sit in a continuum, and in this aspect of being mentally healthy, you can sit right up here or you could sit right down here. There's still a lot of leeway within what is categorized as mentally healthy. So yeah, that's something to be aware of. And obviously, you can move up and down the continuum at different times depending on what's going on in one's life. So this idea of kind of a definition of mentally healthy, obviously it's hard to put a definition to this kind of thing. But a generally positive state, this doesn't mean, the world is all rainbows and sunshine and all that all the time. You're not so happy all the time. But generally being in a positive state, not being in a pessimistic state all the time. But again, I just want to flag, it's not this idea of whatever comes your way, you're smiling, you're always positive about. It means as well, you have proper emotional regulation. You're able to understand when an event should make you sad or should make you upset, but also this idea of being able to bounce back and those sorts of things. So on that idea of bouncing back, coping with challenges, working productively, forming relationships with others, that sort of thing. So obviously we can kind of, again, slip up and down this continuum. So this idea of a mental health problem, it may be a brief sort of short thing. And once things get a little bit more serious, it may be a diagnosable mental health disorder. So this is obviously when you would be diagnosed. So it's, to do with seeing a psychiatrist and things like that. It's not just do I kind of feel this way? Do I kind of feel it's something a little bit more chronic? It happens over a long period of time and you have to fulfill certain criteria according to the DSM, sort of like the handbook of mental health disorders, that sort of thing. Okay, so things that affect where we sort of sit on this continuum, things that affect our mental well-being are our internal and our external factors. So internal means that they originate within ourselves. So, our genetic makeup, our feelings, our beliefs, that sort of thing. And obviously that can dictate where you're sitting on that continuum. So if you, have certain thoughts, if you've got certain feelings, you may be right up the mentally healthy, you may be a little bit lower down, you may be a little bit more stressed, that sort of thing. And external factors, anything that originate outside the individual. So your relationships with someone, life events, cultural influences as well, they can all influence your mental well-being. So hopefully that makes sense. In terms of some important definitions to know, these kind of sit, sometimes on their own little continuum as well. Phobia is really important and we'll get into it in a second. But you need to understand the distinction between stress, anxiety, and phobia. So we've talked a bit about stress in Unit 3. So you guys should be, experts on this sort of thing. But with your definition of stress, it's more of this kind of goes from like more appropriate to sort of more inappropriate. So stress is a very normal emotion, obviously. Very common, you can experience it due to a lot of different reasons. And it can be, good and bad. But if you experience stress, you may slip down that continuum a little bit, but it doesn't, it might not mean that you're, extremely stressed out all the time and, you're extremely anxious all the time. It just means that, something is causing a period of stress. Anxiety is separated from stress in this idea that it's always sort of negative and we're always thinking about something going wrong in the future. So stress, often we think about stress being negative. Obviously, sometimes it can be positive as well. But when you think about, this sort of negative source of stress or negative feelings towards stress, it can be, something from the past. It can be something from, the present, something from the future. Anxiety is very similar to stress, but it's this idea of always thinking about something that's going wrong in the future and these feelings that, something is about to go wrong, this sort of apprehension, that sort of thing. Phobia is much sort of further down this continuum. Again, it's a diagnosable condition. So again, thinking of a psychiatrist or a psychologist would diagnose a phobia. It's not, like sometimes you can obviously say, okay, yes, I'm stressed. Okay, yes, I feel quite anxious. A phobia, so this idea of having an excessive fear of something, that's something that's diagnosed. So the idea with the phobia is, of course, you've got an excessive fear of something, but particularly this idea that it's out of proportion to what it's kind of reasonable to be fearful of. So if you've got a fear of sharks, kind of valid, like they might bite you or something like that, or like a fear of flying, as in you might be a little bit afraid of flying and that idea that sure, something can go wrong, or a fear of heights. But if it's a phobia, it's this idea that you maybe never go to the beach or you never want to even look at sand because of this idea that you fear that, in this body of water there may be a shark. So this idea that it's a bit out of proportion. Or, if you don't want to go on a plane, sure, but maybe this idea that maybe you don't want to look at pictures of planes or something like that, or you don't want to drop your friend at the airport, something like that. This idea that the threat caused by this certain stimulus, this certain event, is out of proportion to the fear. Okay, so in terms of ways that we consider mental well-being, this idea of a high level of functioning. So functioning, it's a very general term. It's basically just this idea that the person is kind of functioning well and able to meet the demands of sort of life almost. So some of these things that we think about, so you're productive at school, you're productive at work, your relationships with your family and friends are, it doesn't have to be going well, but this idea that you can form them well, this sort of thing. You've got your everyday living skills, as in just independently taking care of yourself. Reasonable cognitive skills in that you can make reasonable decisions, judgments, that sort of thing, and reasonable emotional control. So you can see how these sort of things would comprise a high level of functioning, and that if you had to have some of these be a little bit poorer, like maybe you're not forming any relationships at all, are always having bad relationships with other people, maybe you're not very productive at work, maybe you're kind of struggling with everyday basic living skills, that may be what you would call a lower level of functioning, and that can obviously impact your mental well-being. So resilience, this is a really important one as well. This idea of being able to bounce back from certain challenges, being able to overcome challenges and kind of adapt and keep going ultimately. So a higher level of resilience obviously associated with sort of a higher level of mental well-being, because of this idea of when challenges arise, they can be perceived in a bit more of an perhaps optimistic way, or the idea is that one can perceive that I'm going to overcome this hurdle, as opposed to if this challenge comes up and it sort of is the end of the world, that sort of thing, kind of that poor resilience. You can see how those two different perspectives would lead someone to have, a higher mental well-being or a poorer mental well-being. So we kind of tie in often, if you are displaying a bit more resilience, to have high self-efficacy, high self-esteem. So this sort of thing of just sort of a bit more trust or confidence in one's abilities to overcome a specific task. So in saying this, you're not born with high resilience or low resilience. You may be more inclined for something, but it changes throughout life. It changes based on, the life events, the people that you're surrounded with, your attitudes, your beliefs at the time, those sort of things. But high resilience, just like high levels of functioning associated with kind of a stronger or higher mental well-being. Okay, so we're looking at this framework. So social and emotional well-being, it's also known as SEWB. So that's abbreviated on the study design as well. So this is a specific framework that's used particularly by the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. And it's this idea of considering the connections across different domains and how they impact one's mental well-being, again, tying in specifically to social and emotional sort of health. So the different things that are looked at here, so these are specific things that you need to be aware of. So looking at the body, mind, family, community, culture, land, and spirituality. So you can see that it's, of vastly different things, and it's how these all sort of come together and how they can influence one's mental well-being, and how your well-being in each of these categories can kind of, increase and decrease, and how they all contribute to this overall idea. And in saying that, of course, that they can fluctuate as well. So when you're thinking about body, you're thinking about physical health, mind, mental health, and so on. But these are all, they're all sort of respective domains within themselves, but it's important to understand that they all interact, and you're thinking of this forming and shaping one's well-being at that present time. Okay, so the biopsychosocial model, really important to understand. Biopsychosocial, the idea that they integrate. This is a diagram that you'll see everywhere in terms of this little Venn diagram. It's really important to understand this part here, how they all interact, how these two interact, these two and these two. Baker always emphasizes the idea that they all interact equally. So it's not that social is more important than biological, which is more important than psychological. They all interact to influence somebody's mental well-being at the time. So it's important to understand the different categories. What we look at these sort of in the context of is specific phobia and also the maintenance of mental well-being. You need to know which ones are biological, what's psychological, and what is social. Okay, so again, we've got this idea here of specific phobia. That's what we were talking about in that definition before. And we're looking at these sorts of sort of risk factors, or these contributing factors, but also their interventions. So firstly, we're going to look at the biological contributing factors. Again, very, very important to understand what's biological, what's psychological, and what's social. So with your biological, we've got GABA dysfunction. So we talked about GABA, or you would have talked about GABA in Unit 3. So GABA is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter. So we think about the role being to kind of calm down your neurons. So if you have GABA dysfunction, and what we're thinking about when we say dysfunction is your lower levels of GABA, that can lead to anxiety and this idea of a more anxious response, because you've got less of this inhibitory neurotransmitter. It means your neural pathways are firing more frequently than they should. And this can lead to overactivity of the neurons, and then therefore sort of this anxious response. So that's what we're thinking about there. You need to have high levels, not high levels, but high enough levels of GABA so that it can kind of work with glutamate and sort of calm down these responses and inhibit these pathways. But if you don't have that, it just causes overactivity of the neurons ultimately. So again, something you've seen in Unit 3. While I'm saying this, I hope this is a good example of how the study design is very intertwined and how it crosses over. I think I'll talk about this when I get to exam strategies, but I cannot emphasize enough how important the study design is to know and to be aware of what the different areas of study are, and importantly, how they can all intertwine. Okay, so long-term potentiation, again, is something you saw in the area of study 1, I want to say, anyway, Unit 3. And what that is, it's the strengthening of synaptic connections. So if we think about specific phobia, strengthening of synaptic connections, you're basically strengthening the association between fear and this certain stimulus. So for example, a spider, if you've got arachnophobia, you in your brain, you've got fear and you've got spiders, and long-term potentiation is making an extremely strong, or multiple strong pathways that connect these two. And every time you think of these pathways are being fired and it's just getting strengthened and strengthened. And that's basically consolidating that fear. So that's what we can kind of see there. And that idea that the more the connection is used, the more it will be strengthened. So the more you think about your stimulus and the more you think about it in this sort of context, basically the worse the fear gets. Okay, so those are your two biological ones. For psychological, we're thinking of our behavioral models. So we're thinking of classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So your classical conditioning, this is when we're thinking about the acquisition of phobia. So if you see in pink, we've got precipitation by classical conditioning, and the other one is perpetuation by operant conditioning. So if you think about the words precipitation and perpetuation, precipitation, I think of rain, like it's called precipitation, that's what I always think of. It's like the initial almost like triggering of this acquisition, development of this phobia. And then perpetuation is like the maintenance, so maintaining this phobia. So with classical conditioning, we're thinking of this precipitation because it's this initial association that's formed between fear and the stimulus. So Little Albert is this really famous experiment. It used to be on the study design. I'm sure a lot of your teachers will still use it as an example, but if you haven't heard of it, it is ultimately this picture that we see on the left with our neutral stimulus was our rat, and our unconditioned stimulus was ultimately fear. Or I suppose our response was fear, but this idea of something that caused fear. So they would, in front of little Albert, it was like a very unethical experiment and all that, but they would present the rat in front of him and then strike this really loud sort of metal plank or whatever with a hammer. So obviously little Albert would cry in response to that really loud noise. And so we're building this association, I'm assuming that you guys are still very comfortable or all on top of classical conditioning. In saying that as well, make sure over this term that you are revising everything from Unit 3. Really, really important. But yeah, we're building this association. So we're using multiple pairings in this situation. However, when we think about precipitation by classical conditioning, because it's almost so traumatic, you don't really need multiple pairings. Just one sort of pairing is enough. But anyway, in this sort of little Albert situation, they did it multiple times. And then little Albert was left with this fear of white rats and fear of, he showed stimulus generalization. So this idea of fear of anything that sort of looked like white and fluffy, basically. So yeah, very unethical, but very famous experiment. So that's what you can kind of think about in terms of precipitation. They basically used classical conditioning to, give little Albert a specific phobia. So you can kind of think about, the main thing you want to think about here is just the association. Okay, so in your perpetuation by operant conditioning, so now we've got this phobia. We basically maintain this phobia due to negative reinforcement through avoidance behavior. So this is really, really important to know this in this context, negative reinforcement. So again, I'm assuming you guys are still familiar with your stuff on operant conditioning. Any questions you get on operant conditioning and specific phobia, use the term negative reinforcement. It's really important. In terms of this negative reinforcement, we're avoiding the stimulus. So if you've got a fear of spiders, or the fear of dogs, so you've got a fear of dogs. By avoiding these dogs, you are not experiencing fear. And that's negative reinforcement because you're taking, if you remember the definition of negative reinforcement, you're taking away something undesirable, and that's going to reinforce that behavior and make it more likely to occur. So if someone says, hey, let's go to the dog park, and you say, no way, I'm not going to the dog park, you're basically being negatively reinforced to not go to the dog park because you are not feeling those feelings of fear and anxiety and all of that sort of stuff. So that's why it's this idea of avoidance behavior. So if you're walking and you see a dog and then you run the other direction and go the long way, those feelings of fear are alleviated. So next time you see a dog, you're more likely to do the same thing. Hopefully that makes sense. But it's this idea of reinforcement. You're reinforcing something, so you're making it more likely to occur, and it's negative because you're taking away these feelings of fear. But the idea of why this is being perpetuated is because you're more likely to do these behaviors again and again. And so every time you see a dog, you go the long way around, you run away. So you feel good, right? Because you're not being scared. But this is obviously perpetuating that specific phobia, and that's making the specific phobia worse. Okay. So our other psychological contributing factors are our cognitive biases. So Vika wants you to think of two specific ones. So catastrophic thinking and memory bias. Very much in the name. With psych, this is like a bit of a tip. Everything is really in, not everything, but 90% of things are really in the name. So if you try and think about something by understanding what the name is actually saying, that can kind of help you and can save you time instead of rote learning things. Just think like, what is catastrophic thinking, memory bias, and sort of link that, rather than like catastrophic thinking is this thing, but not actually understanding the term catastrophic thinking. Hopefully that made sense. I feel like that was a really bad way of explaining it. But okay, so catastrophic thinking, what it is thinking that everything is going to be a catastrophe. So thinking that being exposed to your feared stimulus, the worst thing is going to happen. So if you've got a fear of a dog, right? Catastrophic thinking is, oh my gosh, I see a dog. This dog is going to come up to me. It's going to eat me. It's going to like rip my nose off. It's going to kill me. It's going to do all of this stuff. So that's probably very unlikely, right? Like the dog will probably come up to you, maybe lick you or something like that. But it's this idea that you're always thinking of the worst possible outcome. And obviously, if you think an animal is going to kill you, it's very valid for you to not want to go near it. But it's the way that thinking will, again, perpetuate this phobia. Memory bias is basically just remembering all the negative experiences you've had with this stimulus as opposed to the positive. So if you, again, are fearful of dogs, memory bias is this idea that you're going to remember the 2 times that you've had bad experiences with dogs, but you're not going to remember the 13 times before that when you had good experiences with dogs. That's the idea of memory bias. Okay, and then lastly, moving on to our social contributing factors. So you've got your specific environmental trigger. This is basically just one really traumatic experience, and this sort of causes the phobia. That's really what it is. So if you've got a fear of dogs, maybe your neighbor's dog running up to you and biting you when you were 4 or something like that. It's that specific environmental trigger. And people with phobias often recognize this as the start of their phobia. Yes. Okay. So stigma around seeking treatment. Again, this can perpetuate a phobia once it's been established because of this idea that people are fearful to seek treatment, sometimes because they're fearful to admit that they have a phobia. They fear that they may be ridiculed, they may be teased by their friends and family. They fear, people might not understand it. If you tell someone, oh, I've got a really big fear of butterflies, as, someone without a phobia, you may think, oh, that's so silly, like a butterfly could never hurt you, all these sorts of things. And that, if you express that to the person, you can see why that would make them a little bit less likely to seek treatment or a little bit less likely to feel comfortable telling someone else about it because they feel, oh, I'm so silly. Nobody will understand. I just don't want to talk about it. And that will obviously continue that specific phobia. Okay. So that is for your contributing factors. So remember, categorize them between your bio, your psycho, and your social. Now we're moving on to interventions. What's sort of nice with specific phobia is that all of your contributing factors sort of have like a complementary intervention. So one of our contributing factors was GABA dysfunction. One of our interventions is benzodiazepines, which basically fix the GABA dysfunction. So it kind of saves you brain space. Like if you just remember one, you can kind of remember the other. Like if you remember, okay, GABA dysfunction is a biological contributing factor. How should I fix that? Oh, benzodiazepines. Okay, then that's the intervention. Hopefully that makes sense. Like you can kind of think of them as pairs rather than here's 6 contributing factors I have to remember, here's 6 interventions. You can just think here's 6 pairs of things that I have to remember. Okay, so As I mentioned, benzodiazepines, they are just a drug basically that mimics GABA. So again, that kind of fixes that issue of having low levels of GABA. It increases GABA's inhibitory effects, and then you have less of that overactivity of the neurons. That's ultimately what we've got going on there. Breathing retraining. So this is, again, it's in a biological intervention because it's a very sort of physiological thing. So when you're exposed to your phobic stimulus, you can often hyperventilate, overbreathe. Obviously, you get into a bit of a panic. Your fight flight kicks in, or fight flight freeze kicks in. And so obviously, with the actual physiological symptom of overbreathing, you can lead to dizziness, lightheadedness, blurred vision because of this reduced oxygen intake and reduced carbon dioxide output, I suppose. And then again, that can cause a whole thing, another panic as well. So learning to not overbreathe and kind of learning these breathing techniques can be really helpful in the situation that you've or in the circumstance that you are exposed to your phobic stimulus and you feel that sort of panic coming in. So obviously it's like a proper thing, but generally thinking of slow, deep breaths in through the nose, out through the mouth. Often, the deep breaths that you think about when you do like mindfulness or meditation, that sort of thing. So that can be really helpful because it can obviously reduce the things that we just discussed. But importantly, also having this feeling of, calm, relaxation, and therefore not having those feelings of anxiety, that fight, flight, freeze sort of kicking in there. Okay, so moving on to our psychological interventions, we have CBT. So CBT is this sort of big psychological thing. So it stands for cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's this sort of all-encompassing therapy that involves sort of replacing negative or harmful thoughts with good ones and replacing negative and harmful behaviors with good ones as well. So if we think about the cognitive part of CBT, in the context of specific phobia, it's just challenging all of these sort of thinking, bad sort of thoughts that we have. So if you think about, for example, our cognitive biases, our catastrophic thinking, our memory bias, the cognitive component can kind of work to sort of fix these. So gathering facts about the phobic stimulus, understanding, why are you afraid of spiders? Like, what's the actual reality of spiders, causing you harm and this and that. And it really works to, the emphasis here is change and replacing. So you're wanting to replace these really harmful thoughts or negative thoughts or irrational thoughts with more logical ones, basically. Your behavioral component is your sort of operant conditioning and that sort of stuff. So you're reducing your avoidance behaviors. You might be implementing those relaxation techniques, exercise, that sort of thing. The breathing retraining that we just talked about. That's kind of going on to your behavior. So you can see how that kind of works with your operant conditioning contributing factor, limiting those avoidance behaviors. Another really important one is your systematic desensitization. So again, the word may sound foreign, but just think about it. Systematic desensitization. So systematic, you're going through sort of this progression and you're desensitizing yourself to this phobic stimulus. So we've got this sort of graduated exposure going on. And again, the flavor of the month here, the word is this idea of replacing, changing something. So we're replacing these feelings of anxiety with feelings of relaxation, ultimately. So the way to do this is a 3-step process. The first one is to teach the individual a relaxation technique. So often we think about that being breathing retraining, so what we've just discussed. So we teach them, how to breathe properly and all that sort of stuff. Then we have the individual create a fear hierarchy. This is where your systematic or your graduated part is going to come in. So if you're afraid of spiders, we're creating a hierarchy from least feared to most feared. So it might be hearing the word spider and then looking at a drawing of a spider, looking at a picture of a spider, looking at a video of a spider, looking at a spider in front of you far away, looking at a spider close up, having a spider on you. Maybe that's the fear hierarchy, right? And then what you do is you basically combine step 1 and step 2. So you gradually work through that hierarchy, and at each step you are using this relaxation technique to basically eliminate this fear. So it's really important in the way that it's graduated. So you're not getting this hierarchy and like running through them and going, okay, photo of a spider, breathe, video of a spider, breathe. It's this idea of you're getting, them to the step that they least fear. And then you're really using this technique properly until that person feels comfortable to move on to the next one. It would be completely useless if you were to get to, the photo and then they're already feeling still panicked. And then you go, okay, let's go to the next one, the next one, the next one. Because that's not going to work, because they still feel fearful at even looking at a photo. They're not going to do well at having the spider on their hand. So it's this idea of they move through each step only when they're 100% comfortable and no longer fearful of this sort of specific situation. And so by the end, when they're able to have that spider on them, it's this idea of that fear really, really being reduced. Okay, and then our social interventions. So we're thinking of psychoeducation for families and supporters. So this is obviously more so, the community, like external to the actual individual. VCAR wants you to know 2 specific things as part of this: challenging unrealistic or anxious thoughts and not encouraging avoidance behaviors. So it's almost really like identical to CBT, but it's like the family and friends just have to do it. So if an individual, expresses their thoughts maybe on this phobic stimulus, being able to challenge them and being able to help them see things a little bit more logically, and also not encouraging avoidance behaviors. So like I mentioned before, that scenario where you see a dog, you want to go the long way around the block. Maybe if your friend or family is with you, they can say, no, we're going to walk this pathway. You're going to walk here. So that avoidance behavior isn't reinforced. And again, that doesn't mean saying like, okay, I'm going to make you like touch this dog and this dog, I'm going to release it from its lead. It's just saying don't actively avoid it. Don't engage in these avoidance behaviors. Okay, so that is it on specific phobia. In terms of our last little bit here, it's on protective factors. So these are basically the opposite of risk factors. So factors that protect one's mental well-being and can kind of push you towards that higher end of the continuum, basically. So we are thinking of adequate diet and adequate sleep. So I'm sure, honestly, this is probably like the easiest part of this area of study because it's very intuitive. So getting a variety of different foods, staying hydrated, enough, food intake, enough healthy foods, minerals, that sort of thing. That's what we're thinking about when you think of an adequate diet, a well-balanced diet, and also limiting, your junk foods, drugs, alcohol, that sort of thing, and keeping nutrition high. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff you can talk about here. Just keep it simple in your short answers. So literally just saying variety of different foods, hydrating, eating, the right amount, avoiding too much unhealthy food. Something like that. Like something like you don't have to be really super thorough and include everything under the sun on the food pyramid. Just, be concise with your answer. And then adequate sleep. So we've had this whole area of study on sleep. You'll be very, very good at this point. So just talking about sleep quality and quantity, talking about limiting, reason for sleep deprivation, that sort of stuff. Okay, so your psychological protective factors, basically the cognitive and behavioral part of CBT. So basically all of CBT. So just this idea of, again, replacing any irrational thoughts and harmful or illogical thoughts with more well thought out, considered, logical ones, basically. And the same with behaviors. Any behaviors that are detrimental to your well-being, replacing them with things that are a little bit more positive, basically. So obviously we talked about cognitive behavioral strategies in CBT in the context of specific phobia. In this context, you're describing it very generally. You're just describing it in mental well-being in general. So obviously when you write a response, it'll be different, compared to what you would talk about in the context of specific phobia. Okay, and then your other psychological protective factor is mindfulness meditation. So again, this kind of controlled breathing, controlling one's awareness, this idea of focusing on, one's thoughts, one's feelings, one's emotions, how one is at the present time. That can be really helpful for sort of centering oneself. And again, keeping aware of, oh, am I getting, am I falling a little bit down that continuum? Am I feeling stressed, but maybe I'm just not acknowledging it? Sometimes focusing and being aware of your internal feelings through mindfulness meditation can be a good way to note things like that. Okay, and then lastly, your social protective factors. So your support from your family, friends, and community. So this can obviously be different types of support. It can be emotional support, financial support, informational support, whatever it is. But this idea that you have support in general, you feel that there are people that you can lean on, and they can be a source for positivity and all those good things. Yeah. So the idea here is that when you may be slipping down that continuum, it's sort of like a catch-22 almost. You probably feel a little bit less inclined to share it with someone. Sometimes you want to isolate yourself. You feel that you don't want to socialize. You might stop going to school, might stop going to work. So it's that idea of you're kind of maybe in the time where you need most help, but you're not sort of able to access it in that way, which is why support can be really, really helpful, especially in those sort of times. Okay, and then we have these cultural determinants of mental well-being. So again, thinking of this sort of relating to our social and emotional well-being in terms of that framework. So this idea of cultural continuity, again, how this impacts and how this sort of influences mental well-being is this idea of obviously kind of being a bit more of a protective factor. So this idea of continuing traditions, continuing aspects of one's culture, particularly in the history when we think about, stolen generations and things like that, and how, elements of culture have been sort of removed. So this idea of preserving these sorts of things is really helpful in terms of mental well-being and on a community level as well. So these are just some strategies. Obviously, there's a whole bunch more, but this idea of promoting more education, welcome to country ceremonies as well, therapy and support groups discussing these sorts of things. Really important in this idea of cultural continuity and preservation. And again, how that ties in with that SEWB. And then lastly, self-determination. So this idea of, again, having power, having resources to support one's own mental well-being. And again, tying this into the culture of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So with this idea of smoking ceremonies, bush medicine, spiritual realignment, these sorts of traditional forms of healing that link to mental well-being in a way that is still very true to their culture and things like that. So that's that idea of self-determination there. Hopefully that is all making sense. Okay.